I am often asked, Dr. Mearsheimer, where should America focus its power? And the answer is simple, everywhere but the Middle East. I believe our continued, massive presence in the greater Middle East is the single greatest drain on American power, strategy, and reputation. It is an entanglement driven by sentimentalism, special interests, and the liberal fantasy of social engineering, and it must end. I insist that we must leave. My argument is simple. The Middle East contains no single, vital security interest that justifies the cost in blood, treasure, and strategic diversion. This commitment, begun in the Cold War and accelerated by the tragedy of 9/11, has devolved into a costly, quixotic crusade that actively benefits our rivals and accelerates the decline of our own global influence. We have wasted decades chasing the illusion of control in a region where the iron laws of realism, nationalism, and local power balances are immutable. To understand why withdrawal is not weakness, but strategic wisdom, we must first define what truly matters to a great power. My analysis must be grounded not in hope, but in the cold, hard logic of survival. The emotional attachment our policymakers have to this region is a sickness, and it is actively sabotaging the interests of the American people. We must abandon the rhetoric of being a global policeman and start acting like a strategic power. What is a vital interest? From my realist perspective, a vital interest is one that affects the survival and status of the state. For the United States, we have achieved the ultimate realist goal. We are the regional hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, our only vital interest outside of our own borders is to prevent any other state from achieving regional hegemony in Europe or Asia. Why? Because a hegemon in either of those regions, a powerful, unified, and dominant Germany, Soviet Union, or China, would have the resources and capability to build a navy and military to truly challenge our own security in our backyard. That is the realist litmus test. Does any state in the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, have the capability to dominate Europe or Asia and therefore threaten the United States? The answer is a clear, resounding no. The Middle East is an important, volatile region, full of ancient conflicts and vast oil reserves, but it is not a strategically vital one in the context of great power politics. This means that a war in the Middle East is, by definition, a distraction. A permanent presence is imperial overstretch. Our vital national security is tied to the balance of power in the Pacific, not the balance of power in the Persian Gulf. We should not be obsessed with regional instability in the Gulf. We should be obsessed with the strategic threats posed by Beijing and Moscow. Any commitment of American military power to the Middle East beyond the bare minimum necessary for intelligence gathering and swift, surgical counterterrorism is a resource being wasted that should be dedicated to the containment of China. Our security should be dictated by structural necessity, not by sentimental attachments or bureaucratic inertia. Historically, our primary justification for a massive commitment to the Middle East was simple: oil. The Persian Gulf sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, and a disruption in that flow was long considered an existential threat that could cripple the global economy and, more importantly, the Western war machine. That strategic necessity, however, is dead. The United States is now energy independent. Due to the shale revolution, we are one of the world's largest producers of oil and gas. Our economy is no longer held hostage by the whims of the Gulf monarchies or the stability of the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, our need to have a massive military footprint dedicated to securing the oil flow has vanished. Furthermore, the oil that does flow out of the Gulf now flows overwhelmingly to Asia, to China, India, Japan, and South Korea. So, if the oil flows freely, it benefits our economic and strategic rivals by providing them with cheap, secure energy. If the oil flow is disrupted, it mainly harms them, while we remain largely insulated. For the United States to continue to commit hundreds of billions of dollars, deploy tens of thousands of troops, and risk war to secure oil supplies for China and Japan is the height of strategic foolishness. It is an archaic policy maintained solely out of bureaucratic inertia and not out of national interest. Our vital interest is the containment of China, not the subsidy of its energy needs. The continuation of this policy is an absurdity. We are maintaining an incredibly costly foreign policy based on a strategic premise that ceased to exist over a decade ago. The most tragic manifestation of the Great Illusion is the catastrophic imperial overstretch brought about by the wars following September 11th. The terrorist attacks were a crime, not an act of war by a great state, and the realist answer should have been a surgical, brutal, and limited counter-terror operation against Al-Qaeda. Instead, driven by the ideological fever of liberal hegemony, we transformed a necessary security response into a quixotic project of nation-building and democracy promotion. We invaded Iraq based on false pretenses, destroyed a functioning state, and attempted, for a decade, to build a Jeffersonian democracy in the heart of the Arab world. We stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, trying to impose a centralized state on a tribal society that had never known one. The costs are staggering. Trillions of dollars wasted, money that could have been used to build infrastructure at home, or to modernize our naval fleet to counter China. But the real cost is not financial, it is strategic. For 2 decades, we were tactically tied down, fighting insurgents in remote deserts, while our best strategic minds were focused on counterinsurgency doctrine. Meanwhile, China was building its industrial base, its economy, and its military, all unchallenged. We spent 20 years fighting shadows, and when we finally looked up, our real peer competitor was at the gates. The wars in the Middle East were not just unnecessary, they were a catastrophic strategic diversion that actively benefited our rivals and accelerated the end of the unipolar moment. We mistook a security necessity for an ideological crusade, and in the process, we squandered the greatest position of power any nation has ever known. When we intervene in the Middle East, we do so under the illusion of control. We believe that our military might and our liberal values can somehow tame the region's ancient, violent forces and guide it toward a Western-friendly stability. This is intellectual arrogance born from our lack of understanding of the region's complexity. The region is governed not by the simple black and white logic of democracy versus autocracy, but by the complex, intractable, and bloody logic of sectarianism, tribalism, and nationalism. When we invade, we don't fix things. We simply knock over the first domino, and the entire edifice of local power balances collapses. We remove Saddam Hussein, a brutal but effective balancer against Iran, and we immediately unleashed a civil war between Sunnis and Shias that continues to destabilize the region today. We removed Gaddafi in Libya and created a failed state defined by tribal militias and open slave markets. We fundamentally failed to understand that local interests, a tribe's need for resources, a religious sect's fear of the other, a nationalist's hatred of foreign occupation, are far more powerful than any liberal ideology we try to impose. We cannot engineer a political outcome in the Middle East because the region's conflicts are rooted deep in history and identity, not just in a lack of American advice. Our intervention, rather than creating stability, guarantees the opposite, chaos. And in that chaos, our rivals find opportunity, and we find only more enemies. Our continued presence in the Middle East is the ultimate policy of self-sabotage. We believe we are there to keep the peace and suppress terrorism. In reality, our presence is the #1 destabilizing factor and the chief catalyst for anti-American terrorism. This is a simple logic of occupation. When you have foreign troops, especially those representing a distinct, liberal, Western culture, stationed on the soil of highly nationalistic, religious societies, you create resentment. You create the narrative of foreign interference. You provide the perfect propaganda tool for groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the various Iranian-backed militias to recruit. These groups are fueled not by some ancient hatred of Western values, but by a visceral rejection of Western occupation and interference. My critics claim that if we leave, the terrorists will follow us home. But I argue that our presence is the single greatest cause of terrorism aimed at the United States. We create the conditions, we create the enemies, and then we waste our resources fighting the inevitable consequences of our own intervention. We are trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle. We intervene to fight terror, the intervention creates more resentment, the resentment fuels new terror, and we justify staying longer to fight the terror we just created. It is a strategic trap. The only way to break this trap and secure the American homeland is to remove the primary catalyst for anti-American sentiment, our massive military occupation, and transition to a far more limited, truly offshore posture. Our troops are not stabilizing the region, they are acting as lightning rods for local resentment. The most significant cost of the Great Illusion is the Great Diversion. As I have consistently argued, the only existential threat to the survival of the United States is the rise of a peer competitor capable of achieving regional hegemony in Europe or Asia. Today, that threat is China. And for 2 decades, while our best strategic minds were obsessed with counterinsurgency doctrine in Iraq and Afghanistan, China was executing the most massive economic and military buildup in history, virtually unchallenged. Our resources, our strategic focus, our national dialogue, all were fixated on the Middle East. Every dollar spent rebuilding a police station in Kabul was a dollar not spent on building a new nuclear submarine to patrol the Pacific. Every army division deployed to Mosul was a division not available to deter Chinese aggression in the Taiwan Strait. This was not a mistake, it was a strategic gift to Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party could not have planned a better scenario. They watched as the American hyperpower willingly bogged itself down in endless, unwinnable land wars, wasting its time and treasure, all based on a flawed ideological commitment to nation building. Our obsession with the Middle East allowed us to miss the single most important strategic shift of the 21st century. The war in the Gulf was a disastrous strategic sideshow that allowed the true antagonist to move into the center ring. It is high time we recognize that the Middle East is a distraction we can no longer afford. We must address the elephant in the room, our strategic entanglement with Israel. I believe America's commitment to Israel's security is genuine and deep, but from a purely realist perspective, that commitment is rooted in domestic politics and cultural affinity, not in vital U.S. security interests. Israel is a uniquely capable regional power. It is not strategically vital to the survival of the United States, which is thousands of miles away and protected by 2 oceans. Furthermore, our unwavering, unilateral support for Israel, particularly during conflicts, is a major source of resentment in the Arab and Muslim world. This support, which often includes blanket diplomatic cover at the UN, complicates every diplomatic initiative we undertake, fuels anti-American sentiment across the entire region, and serves as a constant rallying cry for radical groups. My argument is not that we abandon Israel. My argument is that our relationship needs to be strategically normalized. We must treat Israel as a highly valued, but capable, regional power that is strong enough to stand on its own feet, rather than a strategic dependent that requires massive military and diplomatic cover for every action it takes. The cost of this hypercommitment is the loss of strategic flexibility across the entire region. This entanglement forces us to take sides in conflicts that have no bearing on our national survival, further complicating our withdrawal and giving powerful domestic lobbies the power to dictate a costly foreign policy that runs counter to the broader, existential necessity of pivoting our resources to counter China. The Middle East tail is clearly wagging the American dog, and this is a classic example of domestic politics distorting sound grand strategy. My prescription for ending the Great Illusion is not reckless abandonment. It is a return to strategic wisdom. It is the application of offshore balancing to the Gulf region. This strategy is based on restraint. We must remove the bulk of our forces, the armies, the permanent bases, the counterinsurgency advisors, and leave the responsibility for the region's stability to the local powers. The regional balance of power in the Middle East is perfectly capable of managing itself. The Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, UAE, fear Iran. Iran fears the Gulf monarchies. Turkey has its own regional ambitions. Israel is the most formidable military power in the region, capable of defending itself. This is a complex, local balance that works best when we are not disrupting it. Our role should be limited to over-the-horizon capabilities, ensuring we have the naval capacity to quickly intervene if, and only if, a single state were on the verge of achieving regional hegemony, which is highly unlikely. We can maintain crucial intelligence sharing, limited drone surveillance, and diplomatic engagement, but the burden of defense must fall on the wealthy local allies. We are not isolating ourselves. We are becoming smart. We are shedding the burden of being the regional policeman and focusing our finite resources where they truly matter, in the Pacific. This strategy is a hard-headed realist approach that replaces expensive, failed occupation with efficient, focused deterrence. What will happen when America finally leaves the Middle East? My critics predict immediate chaos, a vacuum filled by Iran, Russia, or China. They predict Armageddon. I argue the opposite. I believe that an American withdrawal will force the local powers to behave responsibly and rationally. Saudi Arabia and Iran will be forced to negotiate a regional détente, as we have recently seen. The Gulf states will be forced to build up their own defenses and engage in local balancing against their perceived threats. The regional balance, currently warped by our massive intervention, will self-regulate. Will there be instability? Yes. The Middle East has always been unstable. But that instability will be theirs, not ours. It will not threaten the American homeland or divert our resources. Our longest crusade will finally be over. This decision is not rooted in moral judgment, but in strategic necessity. We must end the illusion that we are the world's policemen, acknowledge the tragic limits of American power, and stop wasting our resources in a region that is a distraction from the true geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. The end of the Great Illusion is the beginning of America's smart, sober, and successful pivot to the great power competition that truly defines our era.